Hi everyone, today we are going to jump right into chapter 6, which focuses on percents. We're going over four whole sections here, so make sure you're taking notes because this is going to give you vital information for many of lessons to come. All right, so 6.1 to 6.4, the topics within those are fractions, decimals, percents, and solving percent problems. And our essential question for today is, what is the connection between decimals, fractions, and percents? And we're going to talk about that here shortly. So let's start off with percent. What is a percent? A percent is a part to whole ratio in which the whole is always 100. So part to whole ratio when the whole is always 100. And you guys are probably familiar with that with the test, right? The highest score you can get is 100%. Our whole is always 100. You can see that in the model below. 60%, 60 out of 100. So if we were to write that as a fraction, it would be 60 out of 100. All right? All right, let's continue on. Writing percents as decimals. So we're going to start off by writing percents as decimals, and we're going to talk about how to do that. So how do we write percents as decimals? It is really simple. So to convert a percent to a decimal, simply move the decimal two places to the left. All right, I'm going to highlight that little part because that's really important. So make sure you have this written down. So when you're writing a percent as a decimal, all you have to do is you simply have to move the decimal two places to the left, and then your percent is converted to a decimal. So let's do some examples. So 55%, for example, currently the decimal is right over here. So in order to convert it to a decimal, we're going to move it 2 times to the left. So now that equals 0.55. All right, what about 7%? So currently that decimal is right here. We'd have to move it 2 places to the left. So that means to convert that, we'd have to add a 0.07 would be that. What about 188%? Well, now that's big. I'm going to move it 2 times to the left, and that would be equal to 1.88 as a decimal. All right, so currently these ratios would be out of 100 as percents, and what we're doing when we are converting them to decimals is now we're making them unit rates. We're making them out of 1, right? So of course, to convert them back, we would just either move the decimal place 2 places to the right or times them by 100. All right, so let's talk about writing percents as fractions. So we talked about what a percent is. It's a part to whole ratio when the whole is 100, right? So since with a percent, the whole is always 100, to convert to a fraction, you are simply going to write the percent over a denominator of 100 and simplify. As simple as that. All right, so we're going to zoom in here a little bit, and we're going to convert the same values to fractions. All right, so 55%, remember we are just going to use that percent over 100. We know that's 55 out of 100. So the last step would just be to simplify. Do these have a common factor? I know 5 goes into both of those, and that would leave me with 11 over 20, which doesn't simplify any further, so that would be my fraction. What about 7%? That would be 7 over 100. 7 is prime, so that can't simplify at all. That would be the fraction. And then what about 188%? Well, I write 188 with the denominator of 100, but hold on. That's more than The top is bigger than the bottom. Yep, so we'll have to convert to a mixed number once we simplify. All right, so you can do it either way here. You can simplify first and then do it the other way. I can tell right off the bat that these have a common factor of 2 since they are both even. So this would give me 94 over 50, and I could tell once again that they have a common factor of 2. And so that would give me 47 over 25. Now that would be the most simplified version of this, but now we can actually convert. How many times does 25 go into 47? 1 time. And we would be left over with 22 over 25. So this one, anytime your percent is bigger than 100, you will know that you have at least the whole number of 1. So if it's 1 over 100, the whole number will be 1. Let's say it was 250%. The whole number in that case would be 2. All right? So that is how we write percents as decimals and percents as fractions. Moving on. Writing fractions as decimals. So this is really simple as well. So all you do to write a fraction as a decimal, fraction as a decimal, simply divide. Remember, dividing will give us the unit rate, and that is all we have to do. So in this case, how easy is this going to be? I'm just simply on my calculator going to do 27 divided by 50. And like I said, this is something you could do easily on a calculator. And that gives me 0.54. And that's the decimal from that fraction. As simple as that, right? Just simply divide. Make sure we're writing all of these steps down. All right, now writing fractions as percents. All right, so we have a few different options here. So I'm going to give you method 1, which is my personal favorite. So I'm going to say simply divide to find the unit rate. That's how many per 1, right? Then since that's the unit rate and we know that percents have to be out of 100, then multiply by 100. Or I'm going to say, or move decimal 2 times to the right. All right, so let me give you an example. So just like we did up here, we already divided. We did 27 divided by 50. That gives us 0.54. So what we can do is we can simply move the decimal place 2 times, and that would give us 54%. Or if we multiplied 0.54 times 100, that would also give us the same thing, 54, which is 54%. All right, and it makes sense logically because we know that unit rate tells us how many per 1, and we always need our percents to be per 100, right? Our whole is always equal to 100 when we're talking about percents. All right, and then method 2 would just be to make the fraction have a denominator of 100. So multiply to make denominator 100 is your second method. And I'll show you how to do that as well. This always isn't going to be the easiest, especially if we're not given a pretty fraction that easily moves to 100. But in this case, we know that in order to get to 100, it's pretty straightforward. We just have to multiply by 2. Same thing up top, therefore giving us 54 out of 100, which is equal to 54%. All right. Make sure you have all of this written down with words and examples, and let's continue moving on. All right, so now comparing values. Well, this is kind of hard to do just by looking at it, right? Because we have a whole bunch going on here. So we have fractions, we have decimals, we have percents, we have all of those. So the first thing you need to know is in order to accurately compare, convert these all to the same, I'm going to call it the same medium, which basically just means the same, like if they're all decimals, if they're all percents, if they are all fractions, etc. So I'll put in parentheses fractions, percents, or decimals. All right. And just so you guys know, I would never recommend converting to fractions. That's basically always the hardest way. I would say the easiest way is probably decimals, but it's up for your own interpretation. All right. So I already have one decimal right here, 0.44. I'm going to convert the rest of these to decimals because it's really straightforward, right? We know in order to convert a fraction, we just divide. So how easy is that going to be? I'm just going to pull out my calculator and I'm going to do 87 divided by 200. And that gives me 0.435. All right, and then of course I know the same thing's true over here with this fraction. I'm simply just going to divide, once again, easy peasy. And this time I get 0.42 for that. And then the last one I have is a percent. Remember, super easy when we are converting from a percent to a decimal. We just have to move the decimal place 2 times to the left. And this is now 0.437. All right, so I'm just going to write these all down here as decimals, and then we can go ahead and compare them from least to greatest. So 0.435, 0.44, 0.437, and 0.42. All right, if you are confused on how to compare decimals, remember we look at the first values first, and then if we can't compare from there, we continue to move right. So we just compare the values moving right. All right, so to start, all of these first values are 4s, so we have to move to the next one. 3, 4, 3, 2. All right, so 2 is obviously the smallest out of those, so 0.42 goes first. And right underneath, I'm just going to write what it was before, which was 21 over 50. All right, after that, we're going to compare, that one's out of here now. We're going to compare these values. So once again, these both have 3, 3, and 3. So we'll have to move on to the next value of 5 and 7. Well, 5 is smaller than 7, which means that 0.435 comes next. And then let me write the value under there as well. Before that was 87 over 200. And then of course, next would be 0.437, which was 43.7 before percent. And then the last one would be 0.44, which was already that decimal. All right, so there is how we can compare and order values that are different. We would just have to convert them all to the same medium, whether that be decimals, percents, fractions, although I wouldn't really ever recommend fractions. Percents and decimals would be easier. All right, make sure that's all written down and let's move on. All right, so solving percent problems, this is where the fun comes in. We are going to talk about some different methods to solve percent problems. So when we're finding the percent of the number, like the example given here, 25% of 40 is what number? We have 2 different methods to do this. So one is to set up a proportion, cross multiply and solve, and the other method would be an equation. I'm going to go over both. All right, so the first step here would be to set up a proportion with the given info. And let's specifically relate to this example now. All right, so this says 25% of 40 is what number? All right, so first of all, we know any percent is out of 100, right? So I'm going to set up 25 over 100, and so 25% of 40 is what number? So we're looking for 25% of 40, right? So this value should be the missing value up next to 25 because 40 in this case is representing the whole, right? Do you understand how to set that up? All right, and once we have that set up, we know from there we just cross multiply and solve. All right, so 100 times x equals 25 times 40. Of course, 100 times x is 100x. 25 times 4 is 100, which means this would be 1,000. I would do my last step of dividing by 100, and that would tell me that x is equal to 10. And remember, if you wanted to check if this was right, you just simply plug in 10 over 40. You want to make sure the unit rate of both of those was correct. So when I do 25 divided by 100, I get 0.25. When I do 10 divided by 40, I also get 0.25, so I can be sure that my answer is correct. All right, second method is an equation. So the first thing we need to know with an equation is if we're finding the part or the whole. So in this case, we're finding a part, and when finding a part, we're going to use multiplication always. And what we're going to multiply is we're going to multiply by the percent as a decimal. And we know in order to convert it to a decimal, what do we have to do? We have to move the decimal place 2 times to the left. And I'm just going to write that, move 2 times left. So for example, 0.25, 25%, would turn into 12.25. So this way is really easy. The only hard part about here is just understanding if we're finding the part or the whole. And so all we do right here is we take our whole number, 40, and we multiply by the percent as a decimal, 0.25. And that would also give us 10 if you did that on a calculator. All right, so there are your two methods. The most important part is just conceptually understanding how you're setting up these problems. So that would have to be true on the proportion and the equation. You'd have to understand if you're finding the part or the whole. This example relates to finding the part. All right, last one, solving percent problems, but this time finding the whole. All right, so 75% of what number is 48? So 75% of what number is 48? All right, so in this case, we're finding the whole. We're trying to find 75% of what number is 48. All right, so setting up a proportion, same thing. We know every time our percents will be out of 100, so we can at least know we have 75 over 100. And now the big question would be, what is the missing value? Is it the part or the whole? If it's the part, it's going to go in the numerator. If it's the whole, it's going to go in the denominator. So we know 75% of what number is 48. So that tells us that 48 is 75% of some number that we don't know. Therefore, in this case, the x goes in the denominator. All right, so what we would do here, just like we do before, is cross multiply and solve. So 75 times x equals 100 times 48. So 75x equals 4,800. And of course, we would take the last step and divide each side by 75. And that would leave us with x equaling 64. And in order for us to check to make sure we're correct, please take that last step of just simply dividing to make sure these percents are actually equal, because that could help you to find a mistake. Let's say you set up your proportion incorrectly. So 75% of 100 is 0.75, and 48 out of 64 equals 0.75 as well. Therefore, I know my answer is correct. All right, so for an equation, this is the important part. When finding a whole, you're going to use division. And here's a way you can remember which to use. So whenever we're dividing by a decimal, something smaller than 1, that's actually going to make our values bigger. Just like for finding a part, when we're multiplying by something smaller than 1, that's actually going to make our values smaller. So we're going to use division when finding a whole, okay? And then the second step would once again to be convert the percent to a decimal. Then divide the whole number by that. All right. So we're going to convert the percent to a decimal, then we're going to divide the whole number by that. Remember, we already have notes previously of how we convert that percent to a decimal. All you do is move the decimal place 2 times to the left, so that equals 0.75. So we would just do 48 divided by 0.75, and that would give us 64. All right, and even if you use the equation method, I'm just letting you guys know you can still make sure it's 75%. So we can still do 48 out of 64 and make sure that's 0.75, which we know would equal 75%. All right? All right, guys, I know that was a lot of information. Please make sure this is all written in your notes. If not, rewind and go back because this is going to be really important information. See you in class.